Hi, everybody. Welcome to this edition of Cigar Chat. In this edition, I want to go ahead and talk about this week's Hall of Fame induction in the Baseball Hall of Fame of two Cuban greats. One of them is Minnie Miñoso, played for the White Sox for many years. The man was a legend. I mean, he was just an amazing ball player. He played back in the 50s in the era of when they used to call him the Go-Go Sox, as Greg Bodine would, well, a little bit past Greg's time, but as a kid, I'm sure he saw him play probably in the 60s, because Minnie was around. Minnie was around a long time. He's actually the only player to have played, I think it is, in 5 decades, I think it is. And the other Cuban that was inducted into the Hall of Fame was Tony Oliva. And the Minnesota Twins fans, remember him fondly as well, because he was a Minnesota Twin for a long time. My memories, though, of Minnie and Tony are a little bit obviously past that because I'm younger. But I remember every year when I was a kid growing up in Jersey, and then they would do this in Miami as well. But I mean, I went to both, but primarily in New Jersey when I was a kid, they would do an old timers game. It was a Cuban old timers game, and these guys would all come. I'll tell you, some of the people that went to the games were Bert Campaneris, used to play for the Oakland A's, Minnie Miñoso, Louis Tiant, Tony Oliva, Tony Perez. I mean, just so many guys, and most of them were all, of course, ex-major leaguers, Cuban major leaguers. And, some of these guys, they got to play in the winter leagues in Cuba, because Cuba had a strong winter league circuit, I think from like the 20s all the way through like the 50s. So anyway, yeah, every year in the summer, I think it was in June or July, I can't remember which month exactly, they used to do the Cuban old timers game. That was done back in the old Roosevelt Stadium in Union City, New Jersey. And the guy that used to put that together was a Cuban guy who had been a shortstop for the Minnesota Twins. His name was Valdivieso. Joe Valdivieso, yeah, shortstop, Cuban guy. As a matter of fact, Dad worked with him many years ago. Believe it or not, in a coffee business in New York. They both worked for the same coffee company. So whenever Dad would see him, those two would start, talking about baseball and coffee and Cuba, and it was priceless. But anyway, so one year, I remember I was probably about 10 or 11. He took me to the old Roosevelt Stadium. I mean, we won a couple times. And then in Miami, they would do the same event at the Bobby Maduro Stadium, which is no longer there, over there in Alapata, right by the Jackson Hospital. But anyway, so, yeah, I remember as a little kid, one of my biggest thrills was getting to meet Minnie Miñoso, who had been, I mean, they used to call him Mr. White Sox. He was a legend. He was an amazing ball player, great guy. Funny thing is, and I'm smoking a La Floridana today, one of ours, in a Habano. Great stick, by the way. But the funny thing is, by the time Minnie had come up here to the majors, to play in the majors, he had already been a star in Cuba since the 40s. And he also played in the Negro Leagues here. So, for him to be able to get into the Hall of Fame here was really hard for him because he was a Cuban guy, he was black. That's already 2 strikes against you, unfortunately. But the stats, you could not take the stats away from the man. He was such a great ball player. I mean, he played with such hustle. He was like, I guess, the Pete Rose of his era. He was a hustler. Always on the field, trying to get that ball. You know, when he was out in the outfield, I mean, he would always try to get those clutch hits. And I think he led the league, I think he was an all-star like 8 or 9 times, which I thought was pretty darn good. He led the league in stolen bases a few times. He was a pretty fast guy, you know. And then, you know, he passed away, I think it was back in 2015. I have his autograph at home. I'll see if I can find it so I could, you know, put it in the video and show it to you guys. It was a real thrill for me to have, you know, to have gotten his autograph and met him. And my dad introduced me to him, right? And here I am, a little kid, you know. Of course, we didn't have phones with cameras and stuff back then, right? But what a thrill, what an honor it was to meet Minnie. And that day he hit a home run out of the stadium, and all the fans cheered. It was great. And, you know, by then, Minnie was in his 60s. I mean, he was in his 60s and he was still, he'd go on the field and he would play, man. It was like, he had more stamina than all those guys. It was unbelievable.
The word icon is tossed around loosely. But when it comes to Minnie Miñoso, it's not enough. To explain the gravity of his legacy, there has to be more. Add in trailblazer. He broke the color barrier for the Southside Nine and set a standard with a hard-nosed approach that terrified pitchers and wrestled away respect from those who didn't want him in the game.
El Minnie es nuestro Jackie Robinson. Creo que abrió el camino.
Let's throw in legend. Imagine playing in Major League Baseball games in 5 different decades. Yeah, he did that. Through his Hall of Fame career, Minnie sparked the imagination of an island of players who saw the Cuban comet soar. The list of Latino players he mentored is too long to list, but even now, his love and joy for the game is reflected in the faces of Moncada, Robert, Grandal, and Abreu.
Al final le tenemos que darle gracias a nuestros antecesores que pusieron el nombre de los peloteros cubanos en Grandes Ligas, sin mencionar nombres, pero no puedo dejar pasar sin contar con Minnie Miñoso, y agradecido de los muchachos y agradecido de la institución por darnos la oportunidad.
Minnie would pass his wisdom on to anyone who would listen, with a laugh that would welcome you and a smile that could light up a diamond. For the outside world, icon will have to suffice. But on the South Side, it's simple. He's Mr. White Sox, and that's all that needs to be said.
And, of course, the other gentleman that got into the Hall of Fame is Tony Oliva. Tonio, like they called him up there in Minnesota, another Cuban legend. Should have been in the Hall of Fame, in my opinion, many years ago as well.
I'd like to say thank you to all the fans, all the wonderful fans, all those fans from all over the world. The fans from, I know a lot of you people traveling long way to be here. I have a lot of family here today who come out for long wait. Friends who is here today who come out for long wait. I appreciate very much. And thank you all those people, especially those people from Minnesota, the fans from Minnesota. I live in Minnesota for 60 years. I love Minnesota, and Minnesota is my home. You know, you guys been very good to me and my family. Estoy muy contento de ser cubano, tú sabes. Y están aquí hoy porque yo sé que muchos de los cubanos están mirando lo que está pasando aquí hoy en Cubita. Y ellos me apoyaron todo el tiempo en Cuba y aquí en los Estados Unidos y en cualquier parte que estén. Tú sabes, mi familia. Me gustaría poder estar junto con ustedes o más estuvieran aquí, pero por situaciones no pueden hacer. Pero yo lo adoro, lo quiero y lo llevo aquí siempre en el corazón. Y cada momento que pasa, mi mente es en mi cubita. La quiero, nunca me olvido de ella y es un orgullo para mí. Y yo nunca pensé en mi vida que yo iba a estar aquí. Nunca. Mi sueño era jugar pelota en Cuba, si era posible. Muchas gracias y que Dios los bendiga a todos. Thank you very much. And God bless you. And baseball being very good to me and everybody who played this beautiful game. Thank you, guys. Thank you.
That little speech that you saw, Tony Oliva, what he said was that he was very grateful for the opportunity to come here to this country and play baseball, but that he always had Cuba in his heart. And you know what? Seeing that, it brings tears to my eyes. And I know that if my father was around, he would be so proud of these guys, you know. Always mentioning the motherland, you know. Yeah. Tony Oliva, he won the Triple Crown batting. He was like the batting champion with the Triple Crown like 3 years in a row or something when he was with the Twins back in like the I think it was late 60s, early 70s. He played on those Twins teams with like, you know, Harmon Killebrew, Jim Cott, Rod Carew. I mean, he was on a really great Minnesota Twins team, you know. And in his induction ceremony speech, he talked about all the Cubans that were with him, you know, when he came up, that helped him. You know, they helped him translate, and you know, they helped him get through a lot of different situations too, right? Because the Washington Senators had been the Cuban League, you know, the Sugar Kings were affiliated. The Havana Cuban Sugar Kings, which was Cuba's AAA team, had been affiliated to the Minnesota Twins. So a lot of Cubans came up through that organization. Pedro Ramos, Zoilo Versalles, Tony Oliva, you know, Connie Marrero, Orlando Pena. I mean, a lot of Cuban ball players went up through the league, you know. And I mean, it was a really big weekend if you follow baseball. And I mean, primarily, you know, in my case, when I was a little kid, my dad would always take me to this little baseball card shop, comics and cards in Jersey. A&E Comics was the name of the place. And I remember, you know, as a kid, my dad would ask the owner, he'd say, "Hey, do you have any other Cuban ball players?" The guy would be like, "Oh, yeah, here, go through this whole stack here," right? He had this whole stack of cards. And we'd go through the stack, man, and we'd buy, you know, baseball cards with Cookie Rojas and Tony Taylor and all these guys. I would get to see them at the annual Old Timers game. Some of them are still alive today, but there's not too many of them anymore, unfortunately. These guys played in Cuba's golden era of baseball. But man, it was such a great thrill to meet these guys, to take pictures with them. They were so humble. Louis Tiant, which is a friend of the family. We stay in touch with Louis Tiant and his son Danny. Good people. He would also, you know, go to the games up there. And just legendary guys, man. I mean, these guys were so humble. You know, they left their country. They were stars in Cuba playing baseball, and they came here. And unfortunately, because of the whole thing with Cuba, they never went back to play baseball. You know, they went, like Louis Tiant went, I think it was the 1960 season, went to play in Mexico City for the Mexico City Tigers, which was a Mexican league favorite. I mean, a legendary team. And he calls his father in Havana, his father had been a star in the Negro Leagues here, I think back in the 20s. So he calls him up and says, "Listen, don't come back to Cuba, because if you come back, you're not going to be able to leave. Because it's going to be communism. And Fidel Castro has just banned professional sports on the island." Which has to be the stupidest thing he ever did. Well, there's so many other stupid things that government, that regime did. And I don't want to get political about it, but I mean, how can I not get political about the fact that he destroyed a whole country? He destroyed, you know, the Cuban Baseball League. Cuba was the number 1 supplier of sugar in the world. Now Cuba's buying sugar from other countries. So he just devastated that whole freaking island, man. He just, everything. I mean, just, anyway, so these guys, you know, unfortunately, they were just ball players. They went out one season to play somewhere else. And then a lot of them never went back to Cuba because that's it. Cuba shut down the professional leagues, and for the next 30 or 40 years, Cubans were playing amateur baseball, and they were the world champs in amateur baseball. Because, I mean, let's face it, baseball's baseball, right? And if they were good at the professional level, of course they were going to be good at the amateur level. Not to mention, a lot of the old-timers that didn't have a chance to leave the island ended up staying there and became coaches for the Cuban national team. So for those next 30 or 40 years, Cuba developed some of the best baseball players in the world still. And, you know, Fidel used to like to take credit. Oh, the revolution this, the revolution that. We developed all this baseball. Well, that was all bullshit because Cubans have always had a good baseball. Ever since the 1800s when the Americans took the sport down there, Cubans have been playing in the majors, you know, as early as Adolfo Luque, who was Cincinnati Reds manager. He was a pitcher for the Red Sox here. The guy was a star, you know, back in like the teens, like the early 1900s, you know. And there were so many other ones. But Minnie Miñoso, going back to Miñoso, he was the first Cuban black player that was signed to a major league contract. And he was going to break the color barrier in Major League Baseball, of course, a year before Jackie Robinson did, you know. So when he came up in 48, a year later, he came up with the Cleveland Indians, and then he did break the color barrier for being the first black and Latino, Afro-Cuban. Because, yeah, of course, we do have black people in Cuba. We got blacks, Chinese, we had Jewish people. Just like everywhere else, there was all sorts of Cubans, you know. When people say, oh, well, you don't look Cuban. Well, I don't know what the hell's a Cuban supposed to look like. We had Italians, we had Spaniards, we had Chinese, black, you know, you name it, man. Jews. I mean, it's a very colorful tapestry of people because people would migrate to Cuba from everywhere. You know, it was a pretty open society. And my dad would always tell me the stories of people that, you know, their backgrounds and where they would migrate from and stuff. What an honor to have both Tony Oliva and Minnie Miñoso in the Hall of Fame. So it was long overdue. I mean, if you guys follow baseball, look them up, look up their stats. Long overdue. A very big honor for the Cubans here in the United States. So it'll be about 5 Cubans now in the Hall of Fame. Martin Diego in Spanish, right? Jose Mendez, Tony Perez, Minnie Miñoso, and Tony Oliva. So that's 5 that I can remember. Oh, and then we have narrators like Felo Ramirez, who was a longtime narrator, also inducted in the Hall of Fame. But unfortunately, I don't follow baseball like I used to when I was a kid. I mean, I lived it, I breathed it. Me and Dad would always go to the games. We'd watch the games on TV, go to the stadium. It was priceless. But the game has become so commercial right now that it's nothing like what it used to be, unfortunately. But, you know, I still have those memories growing up, you know, my childhood memories. And seeing these 2 guys go in the Hall of Fame was definitely something that was long overdue. Unfortunately, Minnie had passed away back in 2015, so he didn't get a chance to see that. But anyway, I just wanted to do a short little video and talk about baseball and the 2 Cuban inductees this week. So thanks for watching. I hope you guys are having a good summer. You guys got to get some of these if you haven't. La Floridana, one of ours. And be good out there, guys, all right? Take care.